Okay, good evening, everybody. We should get on with the program. We're under a tight schedule. What's happening? In lining up this panel, I should tell you that I thought that the two speakers at either end of this platform were going to disagree badly because of some of the information that they were exchanging. And I have since discovered one's an Arsenal fan and one's a Tottenham fan. So I now know that that was a false lead that I was pursuing.
Despite the fact that his name is Daniel Levy, he's not the Tottenham fan.
Right, well, playing
Important
into stereotypes. Now, I'm going to say something just in case any of you who've come for this meeting think it's an opportunity to explain how angry you are about the situation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I hate to disappoint you, but this is not the venue to do it, simply because this is not a political meeting. This is an opportunity to find out what the issues are that Israelis will be voting on or not voting on at the beginning of May, and what that means in terms of the future of Israel in the region, the identity of Israel, the way Israel is understood. So we're staging this for the benefit of all of us to gain a bit more insight, and to help us do so, we are going to start first with Regev-Sanders, who once upon a time was an undergraduate student here at City University and then went off to study conflict at King's College London, and is going to give us an overview of what she thinks is happening in terms of the way the Israelis are approaching this election and what's at stake in this election. Then we'll go to David Newman on my left, who was born and brought up in the region just to the east of Newington Green. He knows the number 7 bus route, 73 bus route very well, and possibly hence the Tottenham fan position. And yet he has spent a lot of time being a political geographer, and that's what he's a professor of at the University of the Negev. And as a political geographer, he can tell you some very interesting things about the political geography of the occupied territories and the political geography of the Israeli political landscape. And then we will come to Daniel Levy, who in his background was an advisor to the Israeli leadership in Israel in the 1990s. He then decided the real action was in Washington and went there and tried to campaign for a more moderate voice compared with that of AIPAC, and then decided to come home.
You set the bar low.
To have an influence. He's interested in getting certain ideas to surface, whether it be in Washington, in Israel, and now here in London. But all three of them between us are going to tell us in about 10 minutes each, before you all ask your questions, what's at stake in the Israeli elections.
Hi, thanks, Rosemary. So I want to speak a little bit about the prospects of a real change in Israel's leadership, specifically a change of Israel's ruling party from from Netanyahu's Likud to the Zionist camp, or what used to be the Labour Party. I'm going to base my analysis on the current mood of the Israeli society today as I see it. I think that in the first few weeks after the early elections were announced, there was this feeling in the air, and I really felt it, that the Israeli people have had enough of Netanyahu, and that therefore there might be a real chance for a change. The high living costs that haven't improved since the 2011 social demonstrations, the fact that at the moment about a quarter of Israelis live under the poverty line, a fact that was, by the way, revealed at the same week as the early elections were announced. All of this clashed with the lavish lifestyle of Netanyahu's family and seemed to have engendered some anger. And the war during the summer, which ended without Israel making any significant gains, the state of the relationship between Israel and the United States, which has reached its low point during Netanyahu's time in power, all of this, coupled with the feeling that Netanyahu is dragging the people into unnecessary and expensive elections, have created, at least to a young, naive person like myself, the feeling that there might be a possibility of change. And indeed, for the first time since the turn of the millennium, the Zionist camp, which used to be the Labour Party now, it's the Zionist camp is the Labour Party together with Atnuah, they joined lists. For the first time since the turn of the millennium, they have actually been given Likud a run for their money in the polls. The Arab United List actually has a chance of becoming the third biggest party in Knesset, and the ultra-Orthodox, which are historically and ideologically much more closer to the right, might have much less seats than they did in the past in the Knesset because of a split in their party, in the main party, Shas. However, despite all of these, I sadly do not believe at the moment that there is a real chance that any of the more left-leaning parties, specifically the Zionist camp, will be able to win the elections and form the Israeli government. So why, despite all of this, I don't believe that there's, in all likelihood, no real change of possibilities. Again, I will try to answer these questions from the way I see the current mood within Israeli societies. So firstly, despite all of the downfalls of Netanyahu, the overall feeling amongst Israelis is that there's simply no alternative. And I believe that this, at least to a very large extent, derives from an immense leadership vacuum in the Israeli so-called left. Israelis like their leaders strong, masculine, and charismatic, ideally with a security background, and this is something that the current Israeli left simply doesn't have to offer. Herzog, one of the leaders of the Zionist camp, with his soft-spoken manners, is viewed by many in the Israeli public as weak and uncharismatic, which in a sense is a complete opposite of what Israelis have listed in their personal specification section in the Leader of Israel application form. Tzipi Livni is the other leader of the Zionist camp. They're supposed to do a rotation, 2 years each, get the premiership. Tzipi Livni is considered unreliable due to her constant maneuvering, jumping from one party or list to another, leaving the Israeli public always wondering, is she a left-winger, is she a right-winger, is she a centrist? And the Israeli public just doesn't like that. Unless you have the credentials of someone, let's say like Ariel Sharon, Israelis want to know where their leaders stand, and they do not like ideological maneuvering that is not conducted in order to get the world off their backs. For example, Netanyahu's Bar Ilan speech. And Bibi, on the other hand, again, despite all of his downfalls, is considered a strong, charismatic leader who could put his foot down when facing the world on issues regarding Israeli security. Therefore, I believe that for the left in Israel to have any chance of ever taking back power, it must recruit leaders who the Israeli public will see as tough leaders, who see the Israel's security at the top of their priorities. Maybe someone like the critical gatekeepers, Yuval Diskin or Ami Ayalon. And when we look farther to the left, we have Zehava Galon of Meretz, which is sadly perceived as a bitter older woman who insists that all of Israel's problems derive from the occupation, a word that the Israelis really, really don't like. And as for the Israeli-Palestinian leaders of the joint Arab parties, well, they're not Jewish. And not only are they not Jewish, they're Arabs. And for that specific reason, the majority of Jewish Israeli public will never vote for them, which is very sad. But overall, once we step into Israel, at least what I consider real left-wing territory, Meretz and the Joint Arab Party, well, they're all just too left-wing for the vast majority of Israelis, which leads me to the next and more important point. I think it's safe to argue that over the last decade or so, perhaps even more, we've witnessed a dramatic social and political shift rightwards in Israel. And what happens once the discourse shifts rightwards on the Israeli political spectrum is that opinions which were not so long ago considered legitimate center-left opinions are now considered radical and anti-Israeli. For example, the idea that we can ever reach any kind of agreement with the Palestinians, with our neighboring Palestinians. And this shift rightwards was especially apparent during the time of the war with Gaza this summer. when hundreds of young Jewish Israelis went out to the street calling to turn Gaza into a parking lot and to kill all Arabs and left-wingers. And while it's really important to remember that those who went out to the streets only represent a very extreme and a very small minority within Israel, it was overall a scary time to be an outspoken left-wing in Israel. I personally received a few aggressive and even threatening responses for posting my opinions on social media from people who I would, up to that point, consider my friends and moderate people. But I think that this more or less demonstrates the mood within a large segment of Israeli society. In many circles, the term left-winger has now become almost a swear word. Words such as human rights and peace have become tabooed, used only by the delusional left wing who, according to some, would like nothing more than to see the eradication of the state of Israel. This, of course, cannot be farther away from the truth, but this is the way things are perceived in Israel of 2015. And this shift rightwards also is very much reflected in the run-up to the Israeli elections. It is not by chance that the Labour and Atnua chose to name their joint list the Zionist camp. That Herzog argued that Netanyahu wasn't tough enough in his war for Gaza, and that one of the first videos published by the Zionist camp as part of their campaign was a video entitled, "What Does Zionism Mean to Us?" It's also not a coincidence that a large part of the Likud and the Jewish Home Party campaigns are based around exposing the members of the Zionist camp as holding radical leftist views. Because in a sense, these elections are being framed around what it means to be a real Israeli, what it means to be a real Zionist, what it means to be a true loyalist. And it's a struggle that the left wing simply cannot win, because in Israel of 2015, almost everything that has to do with left wing is perceived as anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, and radical. Therefore, in order for the Zionist camp to gain any kind of electoral support, it must, as it has been trying to do at least, distance itself as much as possible from being defined as, God forbid, a left-wing party. But trying to, in a sense, disguise themselves as rational centrists, in all likelihood will not help the Zionist camp to beat Netanyahu. And the reason for this is simple. They simply do not represent what the Israeli public care about today. I don't know, perhaps as a result of a vicious circle that entails periods of intense conflict, indoctrination, and public opinion, the majority of Israelis today do not believe that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be solved at all, definitely not through diplomacy. And they want a leadership that will strengthen the Jewish character of Israel and who will stand strong and in an unapologetic manner when facing the international community. And that is the underlying reason, at least in my opinion, that there will be no major transformation of power following the March elections. At the moment, most Israelis do not believe in and they do not want a major change in leadership. I know that this was quite pessimistic, so I wanted to add on a more hopeful note. It is important to remember that everything I just said is not certain. I mean, I think that the Middle East teaches us over and over again that you can't really predict what they will bring. So while I'm not optimistic, I still have hope, and I really wish that the Israeli public can and will prove everything that I just said wrong. That's it.
Thank you very much. Nitzan, you packed a lot of information in there, and I think we may need, in the course of the whole meeting, to come back to this issue of who's defining themselves as a Zionist at the moment and what that's all about. But let's hear David's perspective on what's at stake.
Okay, thanks very much, Rosie. I want to, in a sense, it's always good coming after someone because then you don't have to repeat what they say and you can take it on a step further. I would say in a larger picture I agree with much of the analysis with a few nuances, but I'm going to go off in a slightly different direction. I want to make 4 points in about 15 minutes. 12, okay. 4 points, 12 minutes. Right, each point will take 3 minutes. I want to say something about what do we mean when we say change. what are the issues out there, and that maybe I'll push aside because they've been touched upon, and maybe Daniel will also touch upon them. But I also want to sort of play the lecturer role and say two things about the technicalities of the elections, but what that means for bigger issues. I want to say something about participation rates in Israeli elections, and I may also want to say something about the role of the United Arab Party after the election, if indeed Herzog is the leader of the largest political party.
How do political geographers count?
I'm not talking about political geography here today, so...
No, but was that 4, 5 or 6?
That was 4 points, and 4 points, okay. So, oh, you disturbed my thought process.
I'm sorry.
And because that can be quite significant. I'm not a pollster. I don't know who's going to win the election. I tend to agree with Nitzan that there is a greater possibility of another right-wing coalition government coming together after the election, but it's not completely beyond the realms of impossibility. There could be change, and I think it's important for those of you who don't know to understand how are governments put together after elections in Israel. What happens is that the president of the state of Israel invites basically representatives of every party who has won seats in the election, and he consults with them and he asks them, you know, who are you going to support? Are you going to support the left-wing leader, the right-wing leader? Under what conditions are you going to make a coalition? Because no government can come together without a coalition of at least 61 members of parliament. The Knesset is 120, so you need to have a majority out there, a minimum majority, and as probably all of you know, Israeli governments are usually put together with a coalition of many, many small parties. 1 or 2 used to be large parties. Today there's no such thing as a large party. The largest parties don't have more than between 20 to 30, 20 to 25 seats. They have to come together with lots of little parties to put that coalition together, which means a lot of bargaining. It means the small parties have a disproportionate say in power and decision making and resource allocation, because they can basically hold out. If you're the head of a party of 3 or 4, then you know you can hold out, and then you're going to bring them over the 61 threshold. You can hold out for a lot more than you're really worth. Having said that, there's been a change in the Israeli electoral law, and that is more significant, or could be more significant than we think. The lower threshold for getting into the Israeli Knesset at the coming election is 3.2%. That's gone up, I think, what is it at present, 2 or 2.5? Whatever,
I think
it's 2
it's
or
2 and
2.5.
it's gone to
It's
3.25.
which is a big jump. For many years it was only 1%. Each time you put that lower threshold up, you're more or less saying to any political party, you have to have more votes to get your first seat in the Knesset. But if you have to have a minimum of 3.2, it means that the smallest number of seats the smallest party will have is about 4. Whereas when it used to be 1%, you could have got in with just 1 seat or 2 seats. So gradually the lower threshold is going up. There's been a huge debate over time in Israel whether that's democratic or not democratic. If you look around at democracies around the world, you'll find in many countries in the world, Western democracies, you don't have the problem in the UK, of course, because it's based on constituencies, first past the post, but that's rare actually. Proportional representation, such as in Israel, is actually more common system of government, or at least within constituencies. Often the lower threshold can be 7 and even 10%. So the Israeli lower threshold is very, very low. But what it means is that all those small factions that used to run on issues that divided them have to now come together and run on the bigger issues that unite them. And one of the 2 sectors where that's been really significant in this coming election concerns the Arab parties. The Arab parties are divided amongst 3 or 4 parties, each of which tends to get 2 or 3 seats, and are pushed to the side. Now, there's going to be a really big question about Israeli democracy if Herzog gets that 1 more seat than Netanyahu, which is not an impossible scenario. The polls are showing each day that Netanyahu has 1 more, Herzog has 1 more. Netanyahu's popularity has gone down. He's been in government too long, and what's very interesting is that he even has a lot of dissatisfaction from home. Obviously, the left don't want Netanyahu, that goes without saying. But even within his own Likud party, there's beginning to be dissatisfaction with the way that he's taken over and running the show. And that can be very significant, if not at this election, certainly maybe the one after that, if he continues in the same mold. The president then invites representatives of every party, and the president is entitled to, first of all, ask that politician, that leader of a party, who he believes has the greatest chance of putting the coalition together. He gives him a month, and he says, go and put a coalition together. If you don't do it in a month, come back and we may have to change the rules of the game. In other words, there's quite a bit of power that the president has. In most cases, the choice is usually given to the leader of the largest party. But there have been individual cases where the leader of maybe the second largest party has been given the first chance because he has the greater chance of putting a coalition together. We could potentially envisage a scenario where maybe Herzog would get one more seat than Netanyahu. Again, it's not clear, but they're running fairly close at the moment in the polls. And yet, after lots of consultation with the president would believe that nevertheless, say, Netanyahu has a greater chance of putting the coalition government together because he has more right-wing parties on his side than Herzog has left-wing parties, and that touches on the future role of the Arab parties. Rivlin won't do that with joy, because although Rivlin himself is a president from the right wing, anyone who followed the way he was elected as president will know that he and Netanyahu, if I can use a British understatement, don't particularly like each other. And Netanyahu went out of his way, basically, for most of the presidential campaign to try and ensure that Rivlin would not be president. At the very last minute, he buckled into his own party, and he sort of supported it, but not with a great deal of sympathy and so on. So from that point of view, Rivlin doesn't have any sort of commitment particularly to the right wing, or particularly not to Netanyahu, to ask him to do it. Why do I make that point? Because traditionally, there's a whole big question concerning Israeli democracy and the role of Arab parties in government and coalition government. They obviously will only support a left-of-centre government. But in the past, even left-of-centre leaders have come to the Arab parties and said, look, we want you to support us from the outside, but we can't really have you around the cabinet table. We can't really have you as part of the government because, you know, there's a conflict going on, and the Israeli public don't want a government whose majority is based on Arab parties to make the big decisions about peace and giving up on territories and so on. So there's always been this dilemma, which of course raises very serious questions about what we mean about democracy. As a result of the change in the election law, the Arab parties have all come together. The polls are predicting that they'll get, give or take, 12 seats, which is very significant. That could be the same 12 seats that they would have got as 4 small factions if the election quotient was down at 1%, 2%. But in my view, the significance of a single party having 12 seats is very different to 4 small parties having 3 seats each. How would Israel look in selling its own version of we are the democracy in the Middle East if it came and said we can't put a coalition to government together because the 3rd or the 4th largest party, who have 12 seats, are not legitimate coalition partners? That is a completely different ball game to the situation that exists before, and I think that if Herzog was to get that 1 extra seat, then that could be a very significant factor in how the government is put together after the elections. Another point I want to make is to say that, interestingly enough, for a country where everybody, I was going to say, talks politics, used to talk politics, either to the taxi driver or around their Friday night family argument tables, called the dinner table, participation rates in Israeli elections have been decreasing. Until 15 years ago, Israel boasted the highest participation rates in democratic elections in countries that didn't force you to vote. You know, there are countries which fine you if you don't vote. But for countries which say, it's your choice, you decide whether you want to participate or not, Israel always had extremely high participation rates, 85 and 90%. And that's been going downhill. The last election, it hit the lowest ever, 69%. I talk to my students at university. Okay, a lot of them are political science students, they're more involved, they're more aware, but they say they talk to their friends, and a lot of their friends say, why the hell should we go and vote? we don't believe that whoever gets into power is going to change the Israel-Palestine context. We don't believe there are partners out there that anyone really wants to get back to the negotiation table. Maybe Herzog would push for it more than Netanyahu. I would hope so, at least. And because there's been a huge shift in that a lot of the people your age, students, young beginning professionals, are today, because they don't feel there are any immediate answers to the Israel-Palestine context, have become much more focused on socio-economic issues. There's been a lot of economic and socio-economic protests in the last few years, not from the poor sectors, but from the middle class sectors. Young students with professions who can't get their foot into the housing market. And they look at Israeli politics, they see what we see everywhere in the world. Israel is no better or no worse, it's no different to many countries in the world in that respect. They see a lot of corruption taking place. People are being voted into power who are then being questioned about what they do with public sector resources and maybe skive some of it off for themselves. You've had a lot of this sort of stuff in the UK in the past few years in terms of election funding. The same is happening in Israel. There are a lot of politicians up for scandal. Former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, as you know, is awaiting his final appeal before what will probably be a long prison sentence for fraud and so on. So a lot of the Israeli youth have stopped voting. Now, even if you hit 65 to 75% in the coming election, that's still considered high by Western standards, but nevertheless, that's low by Israeli standards, and it's generally felt that the bigger levels of lower participation tend to be on the left of centre than they are on the more ideological right of centre parties, so that could impact the left more strongly. And coming back, and this will be my final point, and coming back to the whole issue of what will be the role of the Arab parties used to have the highest participation rates of the very high participation rates. Ever since Barak was the Prime Minister of the Labour Party and basically is seen as having betrayed many of his Arab constituents, the participation rates amongst the Arab population have dropped significantly. Now, first of all, that's bad for Israeli democracy, there's no question about it. But it also depends whether, because of the new electoral law, raising the quota, and the potential of a single united Arab party getting 12 seats and even more, will that bring back the Arab constituency to vote for their parties or not? We don't know. We simply don't know. But that could be a very significant factor. So I think these sort of what I would say are, in a sense, very technical considerations play their way out in the wider political realm and could have a very significant impact on who eventually will succeed in putting that government together, whereas I think we expect Netanyahu and Herzog to be pretty close to each other. If the polls are to be believed, one of them is going to get anything, say, from 1 to 2 seats more than the other, but not a great deal difference in that respect. Likud are down, the Labour Party, or what they call now the Zionist camp, are up. They are vying for each other. Nitzan was very right. Herzog is not the most charismatic of politicians, but he's seen as a capable, able person, certainly someone who will come over better in the international scene. He speaks English no worse than Netanyahu, but he's far less polemical in the way he comes across. So I'm sure the international community would prefer to see him there than Netanyahu. But it's going to be very close, and the final say will be who will have the greater ability to put the coalition of 61 together. And I tend to agree with Nitzan at the moment that, in my sort of view, I think that's going to still be out there on the right, but it's going to be a close call.
Okay, I think, oh, thank you. I think you explained the system extremely clearly, for which thanks. And I think we are going to have to come back to this what it amounts to if the character of the Knesset is significantly different, or the character of this Knesset seems even more to the right than previous ones, but not the same number of Israelis voted for it. Where is this country going? Daniel.
So I'll try and kind of pivot off what's been said already and try not to repeat the much of what I agree with in Nitzan and David's comments. And I'd like to be able to answer the exam question of what's at stake in the Israeli election with a big, bold, lots and lots is at stake, but I think I'd be doing an injustice to the realities in this election campaign if I said that I don't think there's that much at stake. I'll caveat that by saying, look, in an election there's always stuff at stake. And that Israel is no exception to that, and there are points that clearly differentiate between the different parties and between the different kind of coalition formations that might emerge from that. And in terms of the overall kind of trends and trajectories, there could be some important differences. But my sense is that the longer term trends that were described, and especially I think what Nitzan said about this kind of rightward drift, those longer term trends aren't really up for grabs in this election. The attempt to define in a more inclusive way what Israel is, the attempt to work through Jewish democratic, that argument is still not really being engaged with, which for me is also the story of the name, the Zionist camp, and of what will happen, because I think I'll answer David's dilemma, one of which that he posed about the Arab parties. They will have nothing to do with the future government because they won't be asked to have anything to do with the future government. And I think if one prediction can be set out quite boldly, and I hope I'm proven wrong in a month's time, that's the one it will be. Israel in the region, Israel in the world. The big picture question of Israel's relations with the Palestinians, whether that's the Palestinian citizens of Israel or the Palestinians under Israeli occupation. Israel's impunity vis-a-vis the international community. I don't think any of those big picture, long-term trends which are sending Israel in a direction that deeply worries me and concerns me for Israel's future, I don't think those are really being engaged with and therefore are likely to change as a consequence of this election. I think it's unlikely we'll have a different government in terms of the mainstay of who's in that government. Look, anything can happen, and Netanyahu has some kind of clouds that unfortunately are less to do with his policies and more to do with uses and abuses of the prime ministerial office and the prime ministerial residence. And there was a new report issued today by the state controller, and I haven't read that yet. I can't see that swinging this election. My headline, therefore, is that Israel is in a period that many predicted post-67. When I say many, many wise people at least, maybe not that many, post-67, which is almost an inevitable byproduct of trying to define yourself as a democracy while managing a fundamentally and deeply undemocratic, unethical occupation which deprives the rights of your neighbors. If you are on that journey and you can't get out of that journey, and it doesn't matter if you're Israel or any other country, you are going to undergo a process of moral erosion inside your society, because that's the only way to deal with the cognitive dissonance of the reality you're living in. Israel is deep into that process of moral erosion. This next government, should it serve out its term in office, will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the occupation of 67. And we still didn't deal with the 48 issues, by the way, before we got to the 67 occupation. Moral erosion naturally can lead to extremism. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is a trajectory towards extremism. An extremist perspective lends itself to denying the reality in which you operate. And so I think Israel is now going through this erosion, extremism, denial of the reality in which we are living, and that makes for really bad policy. That's my headline. Campaign issues. The opposition would mostly like to make this about some of the issues that Nitzan especially raised of the socio-economic realities of living in Israel state, and especially of the squeezed middle class, which helped a party of the centre, of the guy who became finance minister, do really, really well and become the second largest party in the last election, the party of Yair Lapid, for those who follow it closely. The ability to do that is being constantly undermined by the really, really predictable and obvious fact that the guy who sits in the Prime Minister's office has quite an important say on what's going to be the news cycle on any given day. So from the outside, people may look at it and go, wow, Bibi's crazy. This story about him speaking in Congress about Iran and the pushback against that just won't drop from the headlines. I would argue that that in some ways helps Netanyahu, because it's driving an agenda that focuses on national security issues where he almost has no effective opposition. The opposition are going after him on the technicality of the invitation to Congress and on how he's messing with the relationship that is a strategically crucial relationship with America. They're not challenging him on the fundamentals of his Iran policy. And I think unless you challenge him on the fundamentals of policy, he will win out. Because of things I'll come on to, this is an election in which the conflict features slightly more than it did in 2013. It was actually remarkable the extent to which it was a non-issue 2 years ago when Israelis last went to the polls. The other thing I think you should be aware of is, and I say it in the context of the election coming up here in May, and some of what is beginning to happen around that election. Israel is deep into a reality where no one party has ever commanded a majority in Israel since the very first election in 1949. What you had was a period of variations on the Labour Party and its satellites, domination for almost the first 30 years. Then you had a kind of two-party system for a couple of decades almost, subsequent to the first time Labour lost an election in 77. The two major parties then both polled consistently about 40 seats each out of 120. So you had major blocks on which to build, and they could form a grand coalition, or one of them could be a dominant party in a centre-left or centre-right, or left or right government. Today, in the outgoing parliament, the two largest factions in that parliament account for only a third of the seats. Not 2/3, but a third. And that gives you a sense of just how coalition politics driven this whole thing is. Why do I say that? I say that because it lends itself to a debate about, am I going to be in an alliance with this one or that one? And what have I got against this one? And what was I saying about that one last week? And I say that in a UK context because I worry that we'll have less and less of a policy debate, the more we're having a debate about, will someone bring Gerry Adams in through the back door of number 10 Downing Street, or are you going to go into an alliance with the Scottish Nationalists, etc. The other thing to be aware of is just how media ownership, and I say it's just because it hadn't come up, is driving a lot of this election campaign. Of course, that's true anywhere. We have a system in Israel in which one of the largest, I think after the Koch brothers, donors to Republican causes in the United States, a casino magnate called Sheldon Adelson, set up a free daily newspaper a number of years ago in Israel. And that's a loss-leading enterprise that he has pumped a lot of what is tens of billions fortune that the guy has into. Technically, it's not violated election laws, apparently, but it is the in-house newspaper of Prime Minister Netanyahu. That has led to the rest of the newspaper industry taking a really hard hit. Advertising revenue goes to this free newspaper, etc., etc. And that has led to them almost across the board being anti-Bibi, not necessarily from a policy perspective, but because this may be a way of recouping some of what they've lost in this media war. So I think sometimes one can look at the Israeli media and get a distorted sense of where the debate is at. A few other points before I wrap up. I tend to see Israeli politics as divided into 5 blocks. There is a right/far right. There is, and that far right is really, really far right, by the way. I mean, the Likud is kind of makes UKIP Front National. Even the Likud makes UKIP Front National look, elements of the Likud at least, probably the majority, look kind of really kind of happy, clappy, kumbaya type folks. But to the right of the Likud, the Jewish Home Party, and another party even further to the right that's likely to get into the Knesset, whimsical together, Yachad, they are, in virtually any European country, a party espousing their policies would have a cordon sanitaire built around it. No one would go into an alliance with that kind of a party because it is so overtly racist. Then you have, the second block is centre-left. The third block is these kind of meaningless centrist parties. Now, in a country where some really big issues are at stake, it is a royal pain in the butt that every election, about 1/6 of the electorate, every election recently at least, has voted for these kind of meaningless, well, we're not going to take a position on any of the big issues. They'll normally go with the right. Fourth block, which I can consider to be a distinct block, is the ultra-Orthodox. The Haredim, Black Hats, Stamford Hill, both of an Ashkenazi, Eastern European, and Sephardi, Oriental background. I distinguish them because I consider them to be committed to a fundamentalist version of religion and to providing for their community, largely through the state coffers, but they're not very tolerant in general. But I don't see them as committed to a vision of greater Israel and to a right-wing policy when it comes to the Palestinians, or necessarily when it comes to the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's hard for the left to go into a coalition with them, but if there were ever to be an alternative government, I believe they would have to be a vector of that. And the fifth block is the Palestinian citizens of Israel. As David said, and I think it was important he dwelt on that, now formed one party. There was a transparent effort to kick as many of the Arab MKs out of the Knesset as possible by raising the threshold. 3.25 wasn't plucked out of thin air. Some people are saying it's backfired because they've formed this one list. I'm not sure whether the architects of that, who are the provocateurs on the right, who seek to drive greater divisions between Jewish and Arab Israelis, didn't do a win-win. And I say that in the following way. If the Arab parties didn't unite, many of them would have not made it into the Knesset. If they did unite, it made it easier for those on the right to say, you see, they're all the same. They pretend that some of them are communists and some of them are Islamists and some of them are nationalists and some of them are more secular liberalists. They're all running together and they're all running with, and they've made one particular female Arab member of Knesset, Hanin Zouabi, into the kind of poster child of why we have to hate all the Arabs as fifth column pro-terrorists. So I think it's been a bit of a win-win. Let me close by kind of making a last stab at what therefore is at stake. I would argue not that much on the socio-economic front. Actually, the number 2 on the Zionist camp, Labour list, Tzipi Livni, as well as their candidate for finance minister, are way to the right of the social protesters on socio-economic issues. They're classic neoliberals. They don't belong in a party that calls itself social democratic, and there are other ways of talking about that. The democratic slippage issue, which many have defined, a rightward drift as being something more than the atmosphere, the parameters of dissent in Israel, legislation that goes further in discriminating against Palestinian citizens, legislation that shrinks the space for dissent, trying to change the nature of the court system or who sits on the courts. Those things will be affected. The democratic slippage will be accelerated or decelerated. And as I'm not living there anymore, but if I were living there, that would make a hell of a lot of difference to me. And I totally respect and appreciate that. But my final point will be, why I'm skeptical as to how much is at stake is that increasingly I hear the opposition define the problem Israel has as being Netanyahu's positions and attitude are causing Israel to lose international support, to lose our allies, to become closer to being isolated and pariahs. Rather than defining the problem as we will not live in a decent, democratic, secure society unless we deal with this occupation and with our relations with our neighbors, etc. If you've defined the primary problem as being how do we redress this slippage in our international relations, the solution is we have to improve our international relations. That might require not doing very much at all, except putting on a nice face to a shitty set of policies when it comes to how we sell what we're doing to the international community. And that's what worries me from their definition of the problem. I would say that it's slightly different on the Iran issue. In as much as, although the opposition is not tackling Netanyahu on Iran, I see a prospect that if America moves forward with a deal, Herzog and others would take a different position to Netanyahu. I am not hearing, though, a broader narrative on Israel and the region. Netanyahu has an easy time saying Iran, Daesh, they're all the same. Well, hello, right on your Golan border with Syria, they're fighting each other. Iran and Daesh, unless you're a total wingnut, are not the same. No one is owning a realist or sophisticated approach to the region. I would like to think that one thing that's also at stake is a less manipulative, cynical, and I would actually say downright dangerous attitude also to world Jewry. Because I'll close by saying that I think what Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing right now in aligning himself with ISIS and with anti-Semites in saying Jews have no place in Europe is one of the most ugly and despicable ways that I've ever seen a Zionist leader play fast and loose and dirty with anti-Semitism. Let me close on that.
Well, that may be the point on which people want to take you up, Daniel, in terms of understanding the changes in Israel's relationship with the rest of the world. There's two mics down here, which these guys are coming to pick up, and we've got one question over here, one over there, and one in the middle here. So let's take all those three. So let's start over there, and second row. Oh, we're starting on the left-hand side, as I look at it. Sorry about that. Please.
Hi, my name is Alice. I would like to ask all of you, how do you explain the fact that every time, like after there's a... It's on. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
How do you explain that after every terrorist attack, so be it Paris or Copenhagen, Netanyahu is making these big appeals to Jewish people in Europe to come to Israel? What sort of strategy do you think that is?
Thank you. Okay, let's hear the question from up here. Yeah.
I would like to ask, as you mentioned and divided, like the political interest in 5 blocks, I would like to know if who of those 5 blocks still can consider a 2-state solution.
Can consider
A
or
two-state
would
solution.
actually seek?
Would seek.
Sorry?
Would seek a 2-state
Would
solution.
seek a two-state solution. There's one over here. Second from back. There we go. Thanks.
So Daniel Levy sort of touched upon this, but I'd like to get maybe sort of thoughts of the rest of the panel about the cross-party consensus on banning Hanin Zouabi from the Knesset and what the sort of significance of this is, either like symbolically or practically for Israeli democracy.
Okay, 3 very different questions. When you come to that last one, can you explain to those who don't realize what this issue is about banning this member? One of you, please explain. But Nitzan, do you want to do Any or all of those three?
All right, so I can start with why Netanyahu is calling the Jews to come back home. Well, I think that especially now, well, of course, that the elections that are coming up have a lot to do with it. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it is part of his campaign strategy, because if you say, come to Israel, in Israel you will be safe, which is absurd. We were just talking about it earlier. It's absurd to call Jews to come back to Israel, because Israel is much less secure than the places where they live in Europe. But it first of all reaffirms to Jews all around the world this idea that Israel is the homeland of all Jews. And secondly, and that might be more related to the elections themselves, when you are seen in front of all the Israelis to call people to come back because Israel is more secure, maybe on some level you also hope to make Israelis feel like Israel is more secure than Europe for Jews right now. And of course it reaffirms why we need a Jewish state, why we need a Jewish home. And therefore I think it's a lot about giving Israel, infusing Israel, the Jewish state, with more legitimacy, especially in this now with the international community.
Well, wait a minute. Is that strategy inwardly directed or outwardly directed?
Inwardly
Tell us about
directed
the
and
humor
outwardly.
around this issue in Israel.
So of course everyone can see right through this attempt. I mean, it's absurd, and everyone can see it, that anyone would think that Europe is less secure than Israel is. And just a couple of days ago, there was a caricature in Haaretz, which is one of the biggest newspapers in Israel, where you have this banner saying such a democratic country and all the different benefits that Jews in Europe receive and that citizens in Europe receive. And then you see the separation wall with Benjamin Netanyahu standing at its gateways with flowers, and behind the separation wall you can see tanks and body parts and so on. So I think everyone in Israel can sort of see through this. But I think that, as I said, it's inwards and outwards.
I tell you what, wait on the issue of the two states.
Yeah.
To get any other views from you, David, on
No,
that.
actually, I could relate to all of them. I was going to just talk about the two states. I'll just make one very brief comment. I think, well, what's interesting about sort of Netanyahu's knee-jerk reaction to what happened in France, what happened in Copenhagen, what happened slightly before these two issues in Antwerpen and so on, is what's very interesting is the critique which is coming back at him from the Jewish communities in Europe. I think that's very interesting. That's very, people who support Israel, who believe in Israel and so on, but they also feel to a certain extent that Netanyahu is manipulating this in the lead up to elections. That doesn't make what's happening in too many European capitals any better for the feelings of security of the Jewish community as is happening in Europe today, and we shouldn't be naive about that. It's not only political manipulation. There are winds of change in Europe, even in the UK, but less so in the UK. But I mean, it does make it. But clearly, there's been a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to sort of talk about safety and security, never again, the only homeland, and so on and so on. And this needs to be balanced out. And I think it is seen by many as being, in sort of something which, as Daniel said, this issue. Israeli elections are always about security and peace, or peace and security. The question is which comes first and which comes second. We often used to joke, certainly in the 80s and 90s, that one party says security and then peace, the other party says peace and then security. In any country in the world, securitization narratives are very powerful narratives. They can often win that sort of amorphous center of the political map, who are always sort of put in a position of saying, well, we don't really know whether this is a correct narrative or not correct narrative, but we're not going to be the person who's going to make that decision. And if tomorrow, God forbid, because we went in one direction and there is another terrorist attack, they'll say that's because you didn't tie into the securitization narrative. Netanyahu very strongly sells the securitization narrative. That's as true of the issue of Jews in Europe. It's as true of him always raising the issue of Iran. There's a lot of issues about security out there today which he is in a sense leading that narrative, leading that discourse, and that's a very powerful discourse for anybody in any country who is put into this position of having to say you have to vote about your physical safety.
Can I just
I wanna,
jump on that?
Yes, can you? But also, at the risk of complicating matters further, would I not be correct in thinking that since 1917, if not before, there has been this debate about what the creation of a Jewish state would do to the security of Jews in Europe?
David, I mean, I wanted to I'll address that. I wanted to be very clear. I do think a very worrying and dangerous and qualitative change has taken place in the collective security of Jewish communities and Jewish communal institutions and just places associated with Jews, like kosher supermarkets. I mean, you've now had a kind of copycat. You go after freedom of speech and Jews in Paris and Copenhagen. And I do think more needs to be done. There's no such thing, whether it's for Jewish communities or everyone else, as 100% security, as living in a 0% risk society. But I do think more has to be done. However, I think the Netanyahu approach is not the right way of going about it. It's deeply cynical. One part of it is exactly what Rosie said, is it's classical Zionism. I mean, embedded in classical Zionism is the negation of the diaspora, is the negation of the idea that Jews belong anywhere but Zion. This is the Jewish home, so you should go to the Jewish home. Zionism was a minoritarian trend in the Jewish world until the Shoah, until the Holocaust. And one can well understand why that changed. Literally, just overnight, massive change. What didn't happen was that the majority of the world's Jews moved to Zion. That very specific, narrow definition of Zionism was not embraced in practice by world Jewry, and the majority of Jews in the world today still do not live in Israel. What I think it's fair to say the majority of the world's Jews embraced was the idea of Israel being a good thing. Attention, therefore, hangs in the air. Who speaks for the Jews of the world? If Israel says the only place you really belong is Israel, then what does that make me as a British Jew, or a French Jew, or an American Jew, or an Argentinian Jew? Not a full British person? My loyalties can't really be with Britain, with France, etc. We've tended to try to avoid that tension, and there have been structural ways of trying to avoid it. There was an agreement that was a really important agreement in the 50s, I believe it was, the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein document, which was Who Speaks for American Jews, by the leader of what was then the most important American Jewish institution. But I won't go any further down that road. The other things I just want to say about that is there's an absurdity which it pisses me off no end that the opposition aren't going after in Israel, which is Netanyahu is getting away with a message that one and the same time says, European Jews, Europe is not safe. Come to Israel. Israeli Jews, we're about to get annihilated by the Iranians and we've got scary motherfuckers with beards on every border. It's terrifying, vote for me. And accuses the left of running away from Daesh while he's saying to the Jews of Europe, you should run away from these people. So there's a huge absurdity there. Part of it, which is why I called it cynical and manipulative, amongst other things, one of the reasons I use that description, is Netanyahu wants to use this against European leaderships, European politicians, the European political class, to say, your support in any way for the Palestinians is encouraging this phenomenon. We're not in the dock as Israel over what we do vis-a-vis the occupied territories and the Palestinians. You're in the dock as Europeans over what you fail to do over anti-Semitism. And it is an important part of Netanyahu's message. It's a bigger picture of Israel and the world, but I just want to say it's really important that, and this is why I agree with David, and I'm actually proud that you've had Jewish communal leaders doing something which I think they should do more often, but I respect is difficult to do, which is to tell the Israeli Prime Minister where to stick it, which is essentially what they've done by turning around and saying, no, the right response is to fight anti-Semitism, make alliances, make Denmark, France, etc. a safe place for Jews.
Okay, 2 states.
Yeah, I want to say something about 2 states, and that is to say, look, there is one party out there today, which is the far right, Bennett, and what we call the Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish home, sort of is the world of religious science. It's actually a world I grew up in, but they either left me or I left them. I think we both went in divergent directions at one point. And Bennett has come out quite clearly in the last few years and said, if I was in power, I would actually pass a law or whatever it was, and they're saying we no longer support the Oslo Declaration. Now, no other right-wing leader has gone to that extreme. And in other words, we do not believe in a 2-state solution as such. There was a period about 10 years ago when Sharon was in power, ironically enough, when probably the notion of a 2-state solution reached its greatest consensus amongst the Israeli public. Unilateral evacuation from Gaza, he was going to do similar things, so he said, in the West Bank, and he was even prepared to, so he said, to evacuate, and of course he had a stroke, which the religious right see as something coming from above, in order to prevent him from doing that, etc. And but I think you have to put the 2-state in 3 different perspectives, and I'll say one sentence on each one. There's always been some ideological opposition to a 2-state solution, either from the far right in Israel who say we don't believe there should be a Palestinian state, etc., or from what I would call the far left or the radical left, and certainly many amongst the Palestinian world who say we don't believe in 2 states. We think there should be a single binational, secular democracy between the Mediterranean River and the Mediterranean Sea, Jordan River. Everybody is equal, etc., etc. The actual, in terms of political geographer, they have one common point: they don't need borders. Therefore, they do me out of business. But obviously, the power significance of those 2 positions are completely different. One believes you have a dominant and a subordinate power. One believes you're all equal. What has happened in recent years are people who have followed and supported and promoted the 2-state solution all down the road, myself, for instance, who are saying today, maybe we've missed the boat on this one as well. And it's no longer possible, even if we believe in it. In other words, not an ideological opposition to it, but a pragmatic opposition says, how do you draw a border between 2 states? It becomes so impossible and complex to do such a thing, it just can't be implemented. Therefore, can we think beyond the territorial box? And can we think of a way of sharing power, dividing power, separating power, but not along the normal territorial lines? That's something that I work on a great deal today, looking for those sort of ideas. And here the 2-state solution is more problematic because there are people who support it in principle, aren't opposed to it ideologically, but pragmatically say, like so many other things in the last 50 years, we've missed the boat. We always offer the things which, had we offered them 10 years previously, could have been implemented, but we've come to this one too late and it's no longer possible to implement. What does that leave you with? A lot of question marks.
Thank you. And the Knesset member who's being barred.
Hanan Zuaibi is a woman from Nazareth, Palestinian resident of Israel, who, if you were looking at normal discourse within Israel, would have been said to have made very extreme comments about the Israeli state, legitimacy of the Israeli state. So have other members of Knesset. She's come out with words of support, for instance, of terrorism and violence against Israel. There were members of Knesset last time who tried to get her expelled from the Knesset. She is one member of an Arab party, and as Daniel said, I hadn't thought about this sufficiently before I made my comments. It would be very easy in that discourse which may take place. How can you not include a party of 12 members of Knesset? No doubt there will be those who say, oh, well, normally we would want to include an Arab party, but if you have someone who's so extremely opposed to the legitimacy of the state of Israel, and if they're all in the same party with her, how can we have them in there? I think that would obviously be some sort of very convenient excuse not to go down that path.
Okay, we're not going to go further into that because we've got more people wanting to enter into the discussion. There's one here, but he's third. Can one of you come over here, please?
And I'm going to have to go after the next round of questions because we all know.
So the point was made that Israeli elections are always somehow about security and peace. I actually remember from the 2013 elections that the criticism that was leveraged against the left was that they weren't actually talking about the conflict. It was more about socioeconomic issues, about the costs of living, that Lapid and Labour Party was going on and on about. Peace seemed to be off the agenda, and certainly was also off the agenda of Bennett, Lieberman, and Netanyahu. Do you think this is still the case today? Daniel was arguing that long-term issue is not actually on the agenda, and I think he was hinting to the peace process as well. So do you think it's still the case that the left is giving up the peace process because it is so bad in terms of gaining an electorate?
Because it's too difficult.
Yeah.
Okay, you can't have any more. I'm really sorry. Your neighbour.
Yeah, my question is slightly more simple than that. You both mentioned the United Arab Party possibly being cut out of any future government, even if Hezbollah gets elected. I was wondering, in terms of how would that be possible if they are the third largest party in a democracy?
And the microphone now goes behind you and up there. And could we have one down here in the very front row? Please.
Thank you. It's a question on the Israeli electorate. Since 1948, I think just over 3 million immigrants have gone to the United States. 40% of those have come from the former Soviet Union. 90% of those from the former Soviet Union have entered the country since 1990. So the question I've got is, to what extent is this shift to the right a reflection of immigration from the Soviet Union?
As was.
As was, former Soviet Union.
Yes.
Just a quick question to Daniel. Daniel, you mentioned the influence or otherwise of Israel today. I'm intrigued because can it really be that in such a modern, sophisticated network society as Israel, this newspaper has such influence, when in other advanced democracies we're talking increasingly about election media being certainly TV and more likely social media? I'd just like to because The Economist makes the same point this week too, as I'm sure you know.
The same point as you, isn't it?
No, the same point as you about the influence of Israel today.
It doesn't make you unoriginal.
I'm sure you thought of it first.
No, it makes me authoritative.
I tell you what we're going to do. There's two more over this side. Then you, the panel, are going to pick what you want to respond to, starting with David, who can then run out the door while Nitzan and Daniel finish. So there's one here and one there. Gentleman in the checked shirt, yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the Yesh Atid party because they've been kind of dropped off the face of the earth after the election, and you know it's been in the media like he hasn't done anything, and yet he passed through the civil service for the ultra-Orthodox. So I just wondering what your thoughts are on the Yesh Atid party.
Oh, right.
I got traction at something Nitzan said, which is that a quarter of Israelis are below the poverty line, which if you think of who might be on the poverty line, we may be talking 30% or a third of the population. Now it would seem to me that what's at stake for those people in any normal society would be clear. So I'm wondering, is there, given the way things are, is there no place for them to go to get representation? Is it a matter that because things are as they are told or tell themselves that your poverty is not a priority, or are they kind of hyphenated destitute? You know, there's the right-wing destitute, the left-wing destitute, the silly centre destitute, or where are they?
Thank you. Right, David, which points do you want to pick up on, and which thought do you want to leave us with?
Okay, I'll just pick up on 2 or 3 points. One is that this wider picture, which a few people raised, socioeconomics, poverty, and so on. You have that great, dissonance in Israel, where a lot of the people in the real poverty areas, the development towns, are rabid nationalist right-wing voters. And so, so where the socioeconomic factors have started to play a role is more in the middle class than amongst the poverty groups as such, and that's been an issue where, on the back of which Lapid sort of had his, his big push into power. Israel has a history of third centrist parties, which often come up. They have a great first election. They often are the coalition, the power players in the first election. By the second time, they become much smaller, which is going to happen to Yesh Atid. Third time round, they don't exist anymore. Even Kadima, which actually was the only third centrist party that ever actually took over the reins of power for a short period of time, was that law concerning the conscription of the ultra-Orthodox, was that considered a successful and necessary thing? There are many of us who don't particularly support the ultra-Orthodox position of not serving the army, who aren't necessarily convinced that that was really what was needed in Israel today. Last thing, by the way, the Israeli army wants 30,000 ultra-Orthodox soldiers suddenly being part of the army. You know, that's a debate which is still using slogans of the 50s and 60s to try and deal with realities which are completely different today. A hugely growing demographic population who we need to get back into the economic market and who aren't living on poverty. And I'm not convinced that the way to do that in the year 2014 is to force them to go into the army, even though that's seen as some sort of a sacred cow still to that point. Someone asked a very interesting question about the Russians. Yes, I think it's true to say in the first decade or 15 years, on the whole, the large Russian immigration veered to the right. It explains Lieberman, it explains Sharansky and some others. If Lieberman is going to be a much less significant player after the next election, partly because of his own issues and partly because the second generation Russians do not want to be defined in sectoral terms as Russian. I see it again in my students. I have a very good sort of sounding board for these things. There are right wing there, there are left wing there. They see themselves as Israelis across the board. Unlike, let's say, either the Palestinians or the ultra-Orthodox who still vote very sectorally, the Russians, as the second generation students, see themselves as Israeli, and they are a mirror image. They're becoming increasingly a mirror image of Israeli society, and that's a good thing in terms of those who don't want to see more right-wing votes. But clearly, the older generation, yes, came with quite right of centrist views. And you want me to leave you with one thought, and that is to say that I think you can gather the sentiments of the three of us sitting on this table, possibly, but I think it's going to be a close race. It's going to be a question of, who can put the coalition together rather than who is the largest party. I think, I'm not a pollster, I'm not a predictor. I think that it's probably going to be another Netanyahu-led government, but it's not going to be easy for him to put that coalition together. And you're absolutely right. The whole issue of whether the large Arab party are part of this game or not is dependent on whether Herzog does get that one extra seat over Netanyahu or not. There's no way that Netanyahu is going to even approach or deal with this dilemma. It's going to be a dilemma for Herzog if he is asked to put a government together. It's a complete irrelevance if the government goes towards the right wing.
All right, we're going to watch for Herzog one seat. Thank you very much, David. Good luck at the next session, whatever it is.
Well, I'm going to talk about borders and 2 states.
You're going to watch Chelsea.
Okay. Nitzan, what do you want to pick up on?
All right, actually I want to say that I don't think that if Herzog gets one more seat, it's going to create any much of difference, because once you take an actual calculator to your hand and calculate the numbers,
the coalition numbers, yeah, sure.
The coalition numbers just don't add up. Netanyahu has the upper hand by far. About the Arab parties and how come they can be the third biggest party in Knesset and not be part of the coalition, well, that's very simple. First of all, a right-wing government will never ever join the Arabs into their coalition. and a left-wing party might, and I think that's something that might happen if Herzog gets one more seat than Bibi, they will be asked to support and recommend this the Zionist camp to the president, but they will not be offered a place in the coalition, and that's something that Herzog in the beginning of last week has already said, that he will not sit in the coalition with the Arab parties, obviously to gain more electoral support. What you say before the elections can always change, but sadly, I really don't think that there's any chance that the Arab parties will be part of this coalition.
Can we just clarify,
Yeah.
are you sad in part because that says something about democracy?
Of course.
Okay.
I'm sad specifically because it says something about democracy and about the way we perceive the other and the way we, yes. About Yesh Atid, I think that right now it has, according to today's polls, it will have about 9 seats in Knesset. I think it's the kind of party that exactly the people that I think David was talking about, the people who have no one else to vote. They say, well, we're not going to vote for Netanyahu because he's been really, he hasn't done any good for us as the middle class people specifically, because those are the people Yesh Atid are targeting. And they will not vote for the left wing because they are not left wing. Therefore, they are left with either putting a white bulletin in or selecting Yesh Atid. And I think that's where the Yesh Atid power comes from today. There was a really interesting interview today with Yair Lapid, where he laid down his entire political plan for the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which was very interesting and sounded quite sincere to me until he reached the part where he said that Jerusalem will remain the internal and undivided capital of Israel, and there I understood that there's no chance for a real solution there. About the poverty in Israel, it's a problem that goes back to the beginning of the state, and the fact that a lot of and until today. So the State of Israel was established by what we call Ashkenazi Jews who came from Europe after the Holocaust and before that from Russia. And in the 50s and 60s, Israel became to get new immigration waves of Jews from the Arab world, who we call Mizrahi. And those Jews were treated very badly by the Ashkenazi Jews. And those are the people who still form the majority of poor people in Israel and people who are below the poverty line.
What about the ultra-Orthodox, though?
The ultra-Orthodox and the Palestinians.
And the ultra-Orthodox and Palestinians. Yes, of course.
If you're not ultra-Orthodox or Palestinian, you're Mizrahi.
You're below the poverty line, you're Mizrahi. Now, I'm talking specifically about them because I think that the Arabs and the Israeli-Palestinian Arabs, can vote, do have their representation in the Arab parties, and the ultra-Orthodox have their own representation in the ultra-Orthodox parties. But the Mizrahis, they don't have that, and they will not vote. And that's another absurd, I think, in Israel, that they will not vote for the more social parties, or at least the ones that are pretending to be social, like the Zionist camp or like Meretz, because those are Ashkenazi parties, or mainly Ashkenazi parties, who the Mizrahis are considered as the people who have oppressed them and who have considered over them for many, many years. So they will not vote for those parties. So they will vote, and they're traditionally and have traditionally been voting for the right wing, although the right wing supports more right wing policies, which at the end of the day are bad for them. So I think that happens in many places, not just Israel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Classic class-based politics gets distorted through a nationalist ethnic lens, and that's what Mitzan has just described, and the reality in Israel. James, it's a really interesting one, that, why in a sophisticated media environment, we can overplay that, by the way, kind of Tel Aviv middle-class Israel is a sophisticated media environment. Remember, it's really important to also acknowledge the tribal component of Israeli society. When I say tribal, I mean the ultra-Orthodox community are mainly getting, mainly consuming their news from other outlets. Likewise, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Likewise, the other sub-communities. And in a way, kind of middle-class, liberal, pro-gay rights, vegan. My Tel Aviv friends would have slapped me down. They're also just consuming from a particular niche media. And my response to you would really be, think about the impact something like the Daily Mail has had on the debate on immigration in this country. And then imagine a country in which there are only 2 mass circulation yellow, what do we call it? Tabloid. Sorry.
Red tops?
Yeah, exactly. Newspapers. And one of them is the mouthpiece of the Prime Minister's office. So that's, and it's driving the, it's not that it's the only media outlet that's driving the debate.
It's also the only media outlet which is given for free.
Exactly. It's free. Lovely. I'd add, because I think Nitzan nailed it on Yesh Atid. I just add 2 things. First of all, around 10 seats is still a big deal. For me, the phenomenon of a party like that could particularly try and make its flagship issue the enlisting the ultra-Orthodox into the military. What it tells me is that Israeli society is able to view the conflict and its relations with the Palestinians not only as politically an issue that is really difficult and maybe unsolvable, etc., but also as an issue that can be placed on the back burner because it doesn't have direct consequences for me as an Israeli, unless the security environment has deteriorated dramatically, in which case I'm more likely to not go with the left. I'm more likely to say, well, screw them, we've got to fight back. There is a narrative in Israel today, and there has been for some time, that cost-free occupation is coming to spluttering towards its end. There are going to be economic consequences, etc. The daily reality experienced by Israelis is not that. The daily reality experienced is, maybe a government can change the position of the ultra-Orthodox, can change housing prices, etc. They're probably not going to be able to change the Palestinian issue, and my daily life is not that impacted by it, which is why there's a logic to thinking about addressing impunity as a key to addressing the impasse. So it's the luxury of the centrist bloc in Israel, who are not ideologically opposed to 2 states necessarily, coming back to the point over there, to be able to say, I'm going to cast my vote on a different issue, including the luxury of saying, it's more important to me to be against the ultra-Orthodox or to be against making an alliance with non-Zionist Palestinian Arab parties. It's more important to address those things than it is to take a stand on what we do on 2 states, Palestine, settlements, occupation, funding for settlements, etc. That's the overarching reality in Israel. Do
you think reality is going to get up and hit them in the face?
Nope, not at this rate. I see this as a real slow burner. And what you'll see is, especially in the Haaretz newspaper, which was referred to earlier, occasionally, not just in Haaretz, these screaming headlines: Israel faces economic isolation, Israelis are about to go to the ICC, etc.
No, the Palestinians. Oh, be taken to the ICC.
Yeah. I would argue we're an awfully long way from that.
And you don't even think something on the Lebanese-Syrian border could cause them unease. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about it. Those right-wingers who think that ultimately they might get the chance to transfer more Palestinians from the West Bank to Jordan might have to consider that Jordan is perilously close to crisis because of all the other refugees they've just absorbed, and that Israel might actually destabilize a neighbor on whose stability it utterly relies.
You're asking a question that A, is far too strategic to enter the kind of horizon of most people, but also, and kind of this is actually one part I disagree with Netanyahu on. I don't think what's missing from the centre-left alternative camp is the gruff former head of a security agency to be the public front of a position that sounds tough and right-wing like Netanyahu, but just a little bit less. I actually think what's missing is creating a context long before we enter an election campaign in which the right is being challenged on strategic grounds, on what vision one has for Israel's future grounds, etc., etc. And that's just not happening at all. So there's no response to Netanyahu's policy on the northern border, for instance.
You better say the last thing.
The last thing. Well, it's this. It kind of tries to tie together the question down here. Sorry, people that didn't give their names. On has the left kind of given up on making a peace argument? And I feel not only that, which is evident from what we've been saying, but it also goes into this: are you going to ignore the 12 seats of the Arab blocs, and what does one do with Hanin Zouabi? And my lament is that in 1992, when Rabin won that election, Labour, Meretz, which is the party to the left of Labour, and what were then 5 MKs from ostensibly Palestinian Arab parties, added up to 61. 61 is the magic blocking number. Obviously, 120 is the overall size of the parliament. Rabin went and cut a deal with those 5 MKs. He said, if we band together, if we hold together, the right cannot form a government. I may not be able to agree to everything you want, and you may not want to be in a Zionist government. You 5. They were 2 separate parties, 3 and 2. But let's make a deal. Let's make an accord. And I will commit certain concrete things, which was done. There was a written agreement that was put in front of the parliament. Off the back of that, Rabin peeled away another party, an ultra-Orthodox party, not funnily enough, not coincidentally, I would argue, from the other side, and was able to form a government. We have gone so far backwards since that election over 20 years ago. The fact that the Labour Party, when the Arab parties are running on a joint slate, voted to ban a member of that slate, when, as David explained to us, this may well come down to not whether the Arab parties are in the government, but whether they'll have some kind of arrangement with the government, where they'll go to the president and recommend that Herzog be prime minister. It says to me that if Herzog's given the choice of being the junior partner in a Netanyahu-led government, or in heading a government that will rely on the votes of non-Zionist, Palestinian, Arab members of Knesset, he would choose the former. And that's the most devastating indictment of the inability to create an inclusive sense of Israeliness and mission of what Israel's ultra-Orthodox, Israel's Palestinian citizens, the entire Israeli community should be striving for. And therefore, the likely outcome of this election is that Netanyahu, between the right, the centre, and the ultra-Orthodox, will have 75 to 80 MKs to choose from. One likely option. A second option, he may choose to form a grand coalition with Labour and with other parties from the ultra-Orthodox and centrist camp. And there'll be a fight inside Labour.
And rounding off.
Or the very unlikely scenario that the Labour leadership will do a quite significant about turn and say we are ready to form that kind of a government and try and put the numbers together. That's not where we are, unfortunately.
Okay, listen.
Listen.
We have been at pains to record this. It will in due course, and I hope before the election, so you can be held to your word, be mounted on the Olive Tree website. Before I say something about thanks, can I let everybody know that we will have the next forum on Thursday the 26th of March at the more usual time of 6 to 7:30. And the working title for that is The Palestinian Issue in a Rapidly Changing Landscape, which means both the Middle East landscape and the European landscape. And I now want to thank, and would have thanked David in the same way, Daniel and Nitzan, because you have not treated us to a securitization speech telling us all the things that Israelis have to be afraid of. You have treated us to a nonetheless quite passionate analysis of what is right and what is not right in the state of Israel. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.